Hello, my name is Timur Dadabaev, and I am Professor of International Relations at the University of Tsukuba in Japan. Today, I will talk about discursive powers of Russia and China in Central Asia, also touching upon the implications of for EU-Japan strategic partnership. In terms of my main arguments, I would like to give them to you from the beginning so that you would have a clearer picture of what is it that I'm trying to deliver as the outcome of this particular talk. Firstly, the discourses of competition for natural resources and domination in Central Asia by China, Russia, or the US are prematurely and empirically unproven. Very often, any intensification of foreign policy engagements by Russia, US, China, and Japan in this part of the world is prematurely framed as either an attempt to physically dominate this region or compete with other states for regional resources or dominance. In my own presentation today, I argue, however, that traditional power categories like military, politics, and economics are not necessarily the one which matter the most in this part of the world. Rather, it is the notion of discursive power of these states, which I emphasize as the one which define their capabilities and opportunities. Discursive power is defined as abilities to construct one's narrative in terms of intentions in respect to a particular region and sell those particular narratives to the regional countries in order to promote self and to constrain the narratives of the other. The Chinese Silk Road strategy and Russian Eurasian Union constructs are byproducts of their descriptive powers. EU-Japan partnership that I'm going to touch upon in my presentation today represents the attempt to offer discursive alternatives to China, Russia based on combination of technological advances with liberal values which both Japan and Europe possess. In terms of the main questions of this presentation, I focus on the following. First, how can intensification of Russian and Chinese foreign policies engagements in this region be interpreted? Do they relate to this imagined rivalry between the two countries or have alternative nature? How are these initiatives then perceived by Central Asian public and leadership? What are their images and expectations? And finally, what are the implications for EU-Japan in this particular part of the world? Essentially, what I'm trying to find out is the answer to the question of what is detrimental for increasing efficiency of regional international engagements, be those are Russian, Chinese, European, or Japanese for that matter. In terms of layers of analysis, I structured my presentation around this, the layers which define what the discursive power is. And so I focus on the framing of foreign policy engagements of self and the other, by exemplifying this through the usage of cases of China and Russia. I also look into the constructing the attempts to construct regions of their own by both China and Russia, the channels of political messaging, security, economic cooperation, and functionality potentials, as well as public perceptions. And to the question of what is the public perception, I operate with this, quotation, which emphasizes that what the eye see and the ears hear, the mind believes, which I believe refers to the attempt to represent certain things as real and existing in real sort of world. You are well aware that Eurasia is densely populated by different international organizations and engagements. This is the graphic expression of those few. These are the CIS, as a Commonwealth of Independent States, which came into existence as the outcome of the collapse of the Soviet Union. You have Shanghai Cooperation Organization. You have Collective Security Treaty Organization. You have Chinese-led Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and related initiatives. In addition, we do have EU's Eastern Partnership, which covers 6 countries of the former Soviet Union, which are Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. Commonwealth of Independent States, Eurasian Economic Union, Collective Security Treaty Organization that I already mentioned. These are all very powerful images which send the message to these countries about the intentions of those who champion these organizations in this part of the world. In addition to Eurasian Economic Union, which is championed by Russia, we do have in recent years initiatives by countries like China pushing for this narrative of the new Silk Road, constructing the infrastructure, both transportation-based and energy-related, which aims to emphasize connectivity, which links Chinese markets to the European consumers and the other way around. In terms of foreign policy orientations, we have to emphasize that China and Russia use different conceptual frames in approaching Central Asia. In the Chinese case, these are good neighborhood relations because for China, Central Asia is part of neighborhood. Mutual benefit and common prosperity. This rhetoric is very famous for symbolizing the Chinese approaches to many parts of the world, but also applied to Central Asia. Silk Road is a connection, and here we have to emphasize that the narrative, the powerful narrative of Silk Road is very appealing not only for Chinese but also to Central Asians, because many Central Asians consider Central Asia to be the center of the Silk Road, without which Silk Road would not exist. Non-interference into the internal affairs and promoting regional stability. In case of Russia, these foreign policy framings are very different. Russia emphasizes common Soviet legacy. It believes that the common history of regionalism and regional building actually unites these Central Asians with Russians. In addition, Russia emphasizes this notion of the common Eurasian identity based on common values. And the natural question would be, what are Eurasian values? And as the emphasis here is made on the step-by-step transition, both in terms of the transition towards the market economy, but also towards democracy. Primacy of respect towards collective human rights over individual human rights. Leading role of the state institutions in reforming these economies. Again, this narrative is championed by the Russian government, but also communicated to the Central Asian governments as something that unites, the perspectives of, Russia and Central Asia. In terms of, constructing Russian and Chinese regions, again, this, there are two different processes, taking place in this part of the world. While China started constructing its own neighborhood in Central Asia from the attempt to constrain the negativities of the collapse of the Soviet Union by focusing on resolution of the border issues and reducing the potential negative influence of Islamic values on mainland China. It focused on this scheme of 4+1 of regular committees meetings for confidence building and arms reduction on the joint boundary demarcation. In 1996, the Shanghai Agreement on confidence building in bordering areas had been concluded, and as a success story, it paved the way for the 1997 Agreement on mutual reduction of armed forces in bordering areas. Because these initial initiatives were successful, China started looking at this attempt to construct its own regional engagement in this part of the world through the some kind of formal institution. And this actually materialized in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization after the Uzbekistan joined it. In the case of Russia, the process is a bit different. As you well know, the collapse of the Soviet Union was termed as civilized divorce for the former Soviet constituencies, and the Commonwealth of Independent States established in 1991 was actually symbolized as civilized divorce. Later on, 1992, Tashkent agreement on collective security treaty organization has been established, and the main purpose of this particular agreement organization has been to focus on safeguarding the borders, external borders of the former Soviet Union. And this was a very sort of important scheme for Central Asians, because they did face the security concerns coming from Afghanistan at the time when the Taliban was in power, and the Central Asian republics were weak in terms of their armed forces and their nationhood. For a time being, we didn't actually see much in terms of active Russian regional building. However, with the in 2007, we see that by 2007 Russia was getting more aggressive in terms of its own sort of attempts to build its own Eurasian region. And one of the steps was customs union of October 2007 between Russia, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. Later on, the common economic space emerged as a powerful narrative of championed by Russian government in attempt to push for a unification of this three large economies of former Soviet Union. And later on, Eurasian Economic Union of 2014, with the eventual goal of creating Eurasian Union, has been pronounced. And here you can actually see that initially this was only the Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, but later on, the attempts were made to engage Armenia, Kyrgyzstan. In recent years, we actually see that more countries are being sort of pushed into this particular scheme, into this powerful narrative of Eurasian Economic Union by championed by a Russian government. In addition to formal membership, this particular organization also attempts to construct various schemes of engagement with countries like China, India, Iran, Egypt, and others, in order to construct the narrative that what Russia is attempting to build in this part of the world does not actually go into any kind of conflict with these powerful nations of China, India, and others. And so this is an attempt to construct this the narrative, the discursive sort of narrative of Russia having its own region, which does not necessarily mean to exclude other members or other participants. Because these two countries have this kind of different regional engagements, they also employ different political messaging channels. In the case of China, there is this emphasis on an increasing mutual political trust building through intensifying higher level exchanges. While, for instance, in the case of EU or Japan, you wouldn't really see too many high-level visits of officials to Central Asia, Chinese officials visit almost monthly Central Asian republics. By doing so, they're emphasizing their commitment, but also this serves as the way to discuss and channel the political messaging of cooperation, which focuses on pragmatic political coordination and economic cooperation. When I say pragmatic, we mean here that China emphasizes smaller scale projects which need to be sort of implemented before the larger schemes come into existence. And the idea here is that smaller successes will spill over into the larger, more ambitious schemes. In addition to this, political messaging channels that I've just mentioned, we also see the scaling up of cultural exchanges. And this have to do with, these influences of, Confucian institutes, language centers, culture centers. And I think, to some extent, China is aware that, there is an increasing, alarm in Central Asia about, potential neo-colonialism, potentially coming from China. And so it attempts to sort of, spread its own, cultural and linguistic sort of influences in this part of the world to demonstrate that China actually does not have this intention of neocolonial influences, but also increase the number of the people who understand Chinese way of thinking. In case of Russia, again, initial channels of political messaging have been through the CIS. In later years, especially recently, we see that the Eurasian Economic Union is increasingly serving as this channel of political messaging. Frequent meetings of heads of states are taking place, and this is another occasion when Russian political leadership actually has the opportunity to convey its messages. Increasing emphasis is made on economic cooperation as opposed to political one, and in this cooperation emphasized in the particular three areas, which are customs, labor, and energy. For Central Asians in particular, labor and free movement of labor is very important because Russian market represents one of these labor markets for a great number of Central Asian people. And parliamentary diplomacy is another sort of way of political messaging, which is being used by Russian politicians quite often in recent years. In terms of security, again, these two countries are using different security schemes. In case of SCO, although Russia part of it, the emphasis is made on terrorism, separatism, and extremism, and these are the main aims of this organization. And for China, these are the main issues on its political agenda. As a part of it, there is the convention on fighting terrorism, religious extremism, and separatism, joint multilateral and bilateral military exercises, but also there is this regional anti-terrorist structure, which serves sometimes political agenda of both China and Russia, but also is used for anti-terrorist activities. In the case of Russia, it's a bit different in the sense that initially the CSTO has been used as the as institution which is created to safeguard external borders of former Soviet constituencies. Again, there is this shared concern about the terrorism, fundamentalism, and separatism, but again, the focus here is made on safeguarding this Eurasian space, which includes mostly the former Soviet constituencies. For Central Asians, this represent the opportunity to gain access to the cheap Russian arms supplies by Russian domestic prices, which is quite important. Also, for weaker countries like Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, this is also an attempt to secure Russian support in certain regional conflicts. And in the case of Tajikistan, because it borders Afghanistan, the Russian military base there is one of the factors that Tajik government considers to be the factor of stability. Also, as a part of this CSTO and what has left of it, there is this cooperation through internal affairs and security services. However, in recent years, we increasingly see that both China and Russia emphasize, the economic facet of their cooperation more than they do the security facet. And as you well know, and probably there are some presentations and talks within this event today. China emphasizes this construction of the this notion of the new Silk Road, which focuses on energy and transportation infrastructure, which goes all the way through Central Asia. For Central Asians, this is an attempt to place their economies on the map of on the global map by not only turning themselves into the transit point for Chinese goods, but also Central Asians hope that this would lead to the transfer of technologies, both from China but also from Europe. A trade in energy resources, especially from Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan, is very important for China. Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan are the largest, providers of natural gas to China, surpassing those of Russia. And so naturally this trade in energy resources is very important. At the same time, China does not regard economic aid to be the main pillar of its economic relations with these countries. It's for China, providing modest economic aid is a symbol of friendship, and as a symbol, it needs to be symbolic. It needs to be modest. So China does not engage in charity, in relations with Central Asian countries. It does not provide extended economic aid. It's only tiny in terms of the amounts. In the most cases, these are very pragmatic economic loans, or loans based on the projects. In case of Russia, what we see is that again, increasingly we see the emphasis on common economic space, which emphasizes 4 freedoms of movements: resources, services, labor, and finances. And as I've already emphasized, the resources are important, but also labor resources are the most important aspects of which matter for Central Asians the most. By using this common economic space and Eurasian Economic Union sort of construct, Russia again aims to construct this powerful narrative of Russian contribution to this part of the world. At the same time, it attempts to demonstrate that Russia is not attempting to neo-colonize this part of part of the world, but on the other hand, this scheme actually serves everyone who is part of this initiative. There are attempts to expand Eurasian Economic Union and introduce the common currency, which is called Altin. It comes from Kazakh or gold. And so the attempt again to show that this organization has the future which goes beyond this the national boundaries. So what is the public perception of this Chinese and Russian schemes? To put it very simply, to generalize, in the case of China, the over-pragmatic nature of its policy towards the region excludes the emotional attachments towards China, meaning that the public in Central Asia does realize that that China actually brings a lot of economic potential to this region. But at the same time, because Chinese attitude to this region are very pragmatic, and they are focused particularly on energy and transportation, public in general does realize that China that is not committed to the well-being of this region. It's committed to its own national interests. And so this leads to this understanding that although the opportunities offered by China need to be utilized, there is no need to have this idealistic expectation from what China can do in this part of the world. And that leads to the increasingly threatening image, especially in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, towards China, towards its neo-colonial perspective. And it's quite interesting that the bordering countries with China display the signs of increasing concern about neo-colonial sort of tendencies in Chinese sort of approaches, because they do feel the pressure of those Chinese people who actually relocate into their own territories of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan. They also do feel the pressure of the economic goods coming into their economy. So they do feel the pressures from China more acutely when compared to countries which do not border with China, like Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. And we also see the increasing anti-Chinese rhetoric among the politicians. In the case of China, in the case of Russia, it's quite interesting that that while Russia is a colonial power, it did actually have this, the history of colonization in Central Asia. There is no negativity associated with it in Central Asia. Partly it has to do with the fact that many in Central Asia still regard the Soviet Union not necessarily in colonial in colonial terms. They do regard the Soviet Union to be a country which had its own history, which was not necessarily colonial, and they do appreciate certain advances which Soviet history and Soviet Union offered to them. On the other hand, as I've put here, the Russian economic weakness is its strategic strength in Central Asia, in the sense that because Russia is economically weak, it's under economic sanctions from the West. The image of Russia being capable of neo-colonizing Central Asia is rather weak. And so, in that particular sense, economic weakness of Russia currently is considered by many in Central Asia as its strategic strength. Now, in terms of Russian labor market, it serves as very important bridge between Central Asia and Russia, especially between the countries which are populous, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, but also Kyrgyzstan. Central Asian diasporas in Russia serve as pull factors for the Central Asian population. But at the same time, there is this concern about the treatment of migrants, which are increasingly hostile in mainland Russia. And so that serves as a push factor and the matter of concern for many Central Asians who increasingly are concerned about such treatment. So what is there for EU and Japan, and why are we talking about EU and Japan after we talk about China and Russia? The primary reason is that although China and Russia has been engaged in constructing and shaping their discursive powers and narratives that I've just talked about. Recently we see that the EU and Japan are also engaging in an attempt to construct their own narrative, which challenges what China and Russia attempt to construct in this part of the world. Historically, both European Union and Japan have been active in this part of the world. European Union had its, several EU Central Asian strategies, which emphasize reforms of governance, human rights, the rule of law, and independence of judiciary, modernization, and the diversity of the economic structures of these countries, primarily focusing on support for private, small and medium enterprises. There are certain partnership cooperation agreements between certain countries and EU. New generation of enhanced partnerships and cooperation agreements are enacted. And plus there is this trade agreement, GSP plus status, which was granted to Kyrgyzstan and most recently to Uzbekistan. So the relations between EU and Central Asia are quite dynamic, but they're not, up until recently, they have not been framed into the holistic powerful narrative similar to the ones that we've seen in the Chinese and Russian cases. In the case of Japan, there were certain attempts to offer alternative powerful narratives and pictures of what Japan attempts to do in Eurasia. The first one is actually Eurasian Silk Road diplomacy of 1997. You would be surprised to learn that that Japan has been the first country to use this, the notion of the Silk Road in its official diplomacy, championed by Prime Minister Hashimoto in 1997. And the three main components were geopolitical influence, resources, and corporate penetration, because Japan has been at the time the number 2 economy in the world. And so it's private enterprises were the main actors of its economic influence. And so the attempt was to use this potential to penetrate and increase the influence of Japan in Eurasia. Unfortunately, this did not actually materialize into anything practical. And so Prime Minister Koizumi of 2004 announced this, the Central Asia plus Japan initiative, which is another sort of narrative, another sort of discursive strategy to approach this part of the world. It still exists, it has different aspects, different sort of tracks, it's political dialogue, interregional cooperation, business promotion, many others. Again, I mean, Japan has been engaged in this, in constructing its own narrative. However, it was not as successful due to many reasons. And so the most recent attempt that we've seen in constructing Japanese international strategy, which also applies to Central Asia, is the attempt to emphasize the quality infrastructure in order to rival cheap yet unsustainable Chinese and Russian projects. And so, you also see that, Japan attempted to launch different, narratives, but, they succeeded to the less extent. And so, last year, we've seen a new sort of attempt by EU and Japan to unite their perspectives in order to launch a common sort of visionary, common sort of narrative of strategic partnership agreement between the EU and Japan, which also focuses on the connectivity, sustainable connectivity, and quality infrastructure. You see that that sustainable connectivity is part that that the European Union emphasizes a lot, and quality infrastructure is the part which Japan uses and emphasizes a lot. And last month we also had this EU-Japan summit, where the EU-Japan Green Alliance has been signed, and it emphasizes that that environmental standards and the environmental component to the attempt to unite perspectives of Japan and EU in order to construct this the new narrative of what these two countries would like to do in third regions. So this aim to build new notions of connectivity which go beyond the narratives created by China and Russia. They utilize convergent approaches of Japan and EU in Central Asia. They also aim to utilize Japanese corporate and technological advances and European experiences in former Soviet Union and Central Asia. And finally, they attempt to maximize cooperation in the third market. For Central Asia, these initiatives mean more available choices among the strategic partners. As you can see, Central Asia currently is being sandwiched between Russia and China. So the third partner is needed for Central Asia, and EU-Japan partnership actually represents that third partner, or at least this image and this powerful narrative of the third partner. So for Japan and EU, this represents a new attempt to counter Chinese and Russian strategic imagination and discursive powers. And the EU-Japan connectivity cooperation does not actually focus exclusively on Central Asia. It does have components which focus on the West Balkans, 6 countries, East Partnership countries, 6 countries of the former Soviet Union, and 5 countries of Central Asia. They do utilize part of the railroad to connect EU to Japanese markets, but also there is a ongoing discussion about the possibility of opening new routes to connect Europe and Japan through Turkey, South Caucasus and other parts of the world. So in that particular sense, the EU-Japan connectivity cooperation represents a new, discursive attempt or discursive narrative to provide the channels for EU and Japan to be more active in this region, but also provide the third partner for Central Asia. So in terms of the strength of the EU-Japan partnership, firstly, it counters the cheap Chinese infrastructure investments with alternative high quality infrastructure. Well, the natural question would be, what is high quality? And, as defined, by Japan, the high quality infrastructure refers to economic efficiency, safety, resilience to natural disasters, consideration of environmental and social costs, and contribution to local society. That implies transfer of technology and know-how. And so in that particular case, the three pillars of partnership for quality infrastructure are collaboration with other institutions, ADB, AIB, etc. Funding for high-risk projects in third markets, and promoting quality infrastructure as international standard. And this is very important because there are no standards for international infrastructure projects currently, and so the quality infrastructure as the potential international standard is very important point. In terms of the strength, the second strength that EU and Japan partnership offers is that it offers opportunity to utilize the strength of EU and Japan in areas of mutual expertise. The Japanese expertise lies primarily in corporate, private enterprise businesses around the world. EU has an extensive experience of engaging with the former Soviet constituencies. Baltic countries are actually the former Soviet constituencies to start with. So in that particular sense, what the EU can offer to Japan is this expertise of how to approach these regions, while Japan has the expertise in business management and the corporate performance, a successful performance in Asian environments. The third point of strength is that this partnership promotes new non-carbon based technologies and energy resources. One example would be hydrogen. Well, it is well known that Central Asia is heavily based on carbon based energies, and so new technologies, and hydrogen is one example, would be a welcome introduction to the knowledge base and to understanding, or that energy supplies can also be sustainable and environmentally friendly. And finally, the EU-Japan infrastructure partnership in infrastructure offers the third partner to Central Asian countries, as I've already mentioned. Now, the big question is, can EU-Japan partnership for a high-quality infrastructure succeed as alternative narrative to those offered by China and Russia? We have to remember that the EU-Japan partnership is a narrative. As a narrative, it needs to be operationalized. But there are certain challenges to such operationalization. The first challenge is that the share of Central Asia in EU and Japanese economies is rather small. So, how do we frame the importance of Central Asia for EU and Japan remains, one big question. The second challenge is that Japanese interest mainly lies in the area of corporate technological penetration. So, it is the private sector in Japan which drives the interest towards other markets. In that particular sense, the motivation of the private sector needs to be encouraged in Central Asia, but currently we don't actually have too many Japanese companies active in Central Asia. They are very active in other parts of the of Asia, East Asia, and others, but they're not yet very active in Central Asia. How do we make sure that Japanese private corporations have the interest towards Central Asia is another big set of questions. In terms of available financial instruments, we also have to say that these are limited. These are mainly private. Those financial instruments which are available within the European Union and Japanese government, they are in line with their own national priorities. So they do not necessarily merge between the two countries. Japan has its own priorities, EU has its own, national priorities, and so the financial instruments which are available, they often dominate, their own economic and developmental agenda of each country. And finally, there is a lack of basic information on areas in Central Asian region where EU, Japanese corporate communities can operate successfully. These success stories drive the motivation. So, offering the success stories either coming from EU or coming from Japanese corporations actually encourage other private enterprises to go into those markets. So this would be the key in, encouraging participation of, Japanese and EU actors. And now I come to the conclusions. So what are the preliminary conclusions that I can draw here? Firstly, in terms of China and Russia, their close geographic proximity is a significant advantage in terms of their engagements in Central Asia. Energy and transport infrastructure projects, that these countries are engaged in show the sign of the spillover into other areas. So we increasingly see that, Chinese are engaged in, manufacturing. We increasingly see that the Russians are attempting to build the nuclear plants in Central Asia and other sort of projects which go beyond the traditional energy and transport infrastructure. So there is the spillover effect. One needs to take that spillover effect into the consideration when conducting other projects, because even small projects can actually then turn into something bigger. Chinese projects and Russian led Eurasian Economic Union for now are complementary. There is this discussion that Chinese and Russians are clashing in Central Asia, and there is this new great game narrative. Up until now, this is not empirically proven, so we cannot say that that Russia and China are clashing in Central Asia. Their projects are complementary. At least they are not mutually exclusive. And the final point is that increasing concern among the public opinion in Central Asia in respect to Chinese utilitarian approaches to Central Asia is among the biggest challenges for China and countries like China. In terms of EU-Japan, what we see is that these two countries are attempting to build and shape their own sort of narrative in order to build their competitive advantage on human security-centered infrastructure and more advanced technologies. So, in a sense, what EU-Japan partnership represents is an alternative, discursive power and narrative to offer against what Chinese and Russians are doing. In that particular sense, the remote geographic proximity can offer advantages to EU and Japan as well, because they being on certain geographic proximity, they can claim that they do not have neo-colonial intentions. And both EU and Japan are not or do not have this threatening image to Central Asia because of this the geographic proximity. So in that particular sense, although many scholars emphasize that this geographic proximity can be negatively affecting the the cooperation between EU and Japan and Central Asia, I would argue that there is this positivity also in this geographic proximity, because by being so far, you can actually emphasize that that you are not driven by self-interest only. There are some other sort of ideas that motivate EU and Japan to engage in this part of the world. However, a move away from emphasis on energy-related infrastructure and imports of energy resources to EU and Japan is required. Unfortunately, when we look into the preliminary into the literature written on this subject, quite often we see that there are attempts to link the Central Asian resources to EU and Japanese markets. And I think because of this proximity, because of lack of infrastructure, and logistical difficulties in delivering this resources to EU and Japan, the whole discussion gets deadlocked. I think the more discussion needs to focus on, establishing, EU and Japanese manufacturing, capacities in Central Asia, so that, Central Asia can serve as another sort of hub to export EU and Japanese products. Actually, there is a new initiative which is called Made by Japan in Central Asia, and this is the attempt to establish the manufacturing clusters by Japanese corporations in Central Asia, and then export those goods to other neighboring regions. And so that could be one way to proceed in practical sort of attempts to operationalize this EU-Japan infrastructure. And finally, the promotion of quality infrastructure represents both adjustment to the competitive environment for the new opportunities, an attempt to frame EU-Japan's more expensive technology as competitive advantage. So I think this needs to be taken again in line with this notion of the discursive power and importance of the narrative power of the state in explaining what it wants to do at the international level. So I think I will stop here. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will welcome any questions or opinions on this subject matter. Thank you.